In this video, we're going to talk about for loops. A for is a different kind of loop from a while loop. It's used generally when we know how many times we want a loop to run, and we're going to count the number of times the loop has ran. So I want to take you back to the while loop that we started with in our previous examples. We had a variable I, and we use the I for loops a lot because I is like the abbreviation for iteration. Remember, every time we go through a loop, it's called an iteration. So we use I a lot as the counting variable for loops. It's one of the few places where it's okay to use a single letter variable name in programming. You really should use descriptive names that describe what your variables are, but since I is counting iterations, it's a very common way to abbreviate it. If you have two loops, we use I and J a lot of times. The only other places where it's okay to use single letter variables are like if you're doing some kind of graphing and you have X and Y values, that might be okay to use a single letter variable, but in general, you should use descriptive variables. I wanted to explain that because I'm using single letter variables, and this is one of the few exceptions to that rule. All right, so I equals 0. As long as I is less than 100, here's our loop, and we're increasing I right here, and it prints out I 100 times and then prints done. So we're going to recreate this exact program using a for loop. So let's go over, I have another example set up. And the way a for loop works is it starts with the keyword for, F-O-R, and then we have a set of parentheses. Now inside the parentheses, we need to put three things. First of all, I'm going to set up a variable to count with. And this one is going to be in I, and we initialize it equal to 0 in this case. Okay. So we initialize a variable. Then we have a semicolon. And then we have to have a condition. Let's check the condition. Is I less than 100? Okay. And then we have to have some way to modify this condition. And in this case, we're going to use I++. Okay. So that's our for loop. And then we need a set of braces for the block of code that's going to repeat. And inside that block of code, I am just going to put welcome to Java. After my loop finishes executing, I'm going to print done. And we see the exact same behavior with this for loop that we saw with the while loop. Now, let's take a look. We have 1 line, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Basically 6 lines of code with some white space in between it. Over here on the for loop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not a big difference, but we only have one statement inside the loop. When you start doing longer things inside the loop, a for loop is much more concise, and it's easier to find these three things that we have here, which is the initialization of our counting variable, our condition, and our change in the iteration variable. Okay. Realize all these things existed back in the while loop. We have an initialization of our counting variable. We have a condition using that counting variable, and we have a line that changes the value of that variable, increases it by 1 in this case. So all three of those things were present when we did the while loop. A for loop just kind of puts them all together. Okay, but a for loop is always used when counting. It is the best loop to use when you know how many times you need to run the program. So this works great. One thing I do want to point out is that if we're asking the user, let's do this. I'm going to make a scanner. I'm going to call it SC equals new scanner system.in. Okay, I need to import my scanner. There we go. There's my scanner. Now I'm going to ask the user, And actually, I just want to print there. How many times should I greet you? And then I'm going to send it. But integer, int times equals sc dot next int. I'm purposely not using input for my scanner name, just to show you that this scanner name can be whatever we wanted it to be. And then this time I'm asking the user how many times they want me to do this. So instead of using 100 here, I'm going to use this variable times. If I is less than the number of times entered by the user, we keep going. Now, the reason a for loop works here, even though you might say, well, I don't know how many times they're going to put in. For loop is the best loop because before our loop starts, we will know how many times this loop needs to run. So we use a for loop when we know how many iterations we need. And this will do the exact same thing, except now it's going to ask me how many times should I greet you. If I say 4, you can see it greeted me 4 times. If I run it again and say 100, you can, I'm scrolling up there, you can see that it did 100. You can count them if you want, or you can trust me. So we knew by the time the loop started that we were going to know how many times the loop should run. So we used a for loop. Okay, so for is better in cases where you're just counting. While is the exact same thing, requires the exact same parts. It just spreads the loop out and the things you have to have for your loop. It kind of spreads them out all over the place, so it's a little bit harder to read. So when you're counting and you know how many times your loop needs to run, you use a for loop. We'll look at some examples coming up.